and hung by the main sheet, which Winthrop, seeing, fetched the cooper's broad axe, and chopping off the unhappy master's hand, he was swallowed up by the sea. The captain being thus dispatched, Thomas Jenkins, the mate, was secured and brought upon deck, to share the same cruel fate. His entreaties were as useless as the captain's. The sentence they had passed upon him was not to be reversed. They were deaf to his prayers and remonstrances, strangers to humanity and compassion. He was of the captain's mess, they said, and they should eat and drink together. It was pity to part good company. Thus they jested with his agonies. Pial, however, made some struggle, which irritating his murderers, one of them snatched up the axe, with which Winthrop had lopped off the captain's hand, and gave him a great cut on the shoulder, by missing his head, where the blow was aimed, and he was thrown into the sea. He swam notwithstanding, and called out to the doctor to throw him a rope, who, well, poor man, could not hear him, being secured, and laid in irons in his own cabin. And had he heard, and been able to have thrown the rope required, could it be expected that these hardened wretches would have relented, and shown him mercy? But the sinking man will catch at a straw, and hope, they say, is the last that deserts us. While we have life, we are apt to flatter ourselves some lucky accident may favor us. It was next debated what should be done with the doctor. Some were for sending him to look after the captain and mate, but the majority, as he was a useful man, thought it better to keep him. All obstacles being removed, Mitchell saluted Fly Captain, and with the rest of the crew who had been in the conspiracy, with some ceremony gave him possession of the great cabin. Here, a bowl of punch being made, Morris Cundon was called down, and one John Fitzherbert set to the helm in his place. At the same time the carpenter and Thomas Streeton were brought before the captain, who told them they were 3 rascals, and richly deserved to be sent after the captain and mate, but that they were willing to show them mercy, and not put them to death in cold blood, and he would therefore only put them in irons, for the security of the ship's crew. They were accordingly ordered out, and ironed. Fly then told his comrades it was convenient to resolve on some course when word was brought them that a ship was very near them. The council broke up, and made a clear ship, when, in a very little while after, they found it was the Pompey, which had left Jamaica in company with the Snow, the Pompey standing for the Snow, which did not make from her. Soon Haled, and asked how Captain Green did, and was answered by Fly, that he was very well. They did not think fit to attack this ship, but returning to hold their consultation, it was resolved to steer for North Carolina. Upon their arrival on that coast they spied a sloop at anchor within the bar. She was called the John and Hannah, and commanded by Captain Fulker, who, thinking the Snow might want a pilot, stepped into his boat with his mate, Mr. Ray Atkinson, and Mr. Wyatt Roan, 2 passengers, and a young lad, in order to bring her in. When they came on board, they were told that the Snow was come with a cargo from Jamaica. Captain Fulker and Mr. D. Roan were desired to walk down to the captain, who was in the cabin. Fly received them very civilly, ordered a bowl of punch, and hearing Captain Fulker had brought another passenger on board, Mr. Atkinson was also invited down. The punch being brought in, Captain Fly told his guest that he was no man to mince matters, and that he and his comrades were gentlemen of fortune, and should make bold to try if Captain Fulker's sloop was a better sailor than the Snow. If she was, she would prove much fitter for their business, and they must have her. The Snow came to an anchor about a league off the sloop, and Fly ordered Fulker, with 6 of his own hands, into the boat, to bring her alongside of the Snow. But the wind proving contrary, Their endeavors proved also vain, and they returned again in the boat, bringing Captain Fulker back with. As soon as they came on board the Snow, Fly fell into a violent passion, cursing and damning Fulker for not bringing off the sloop. He gave him his reason and said, "It was impossible." "Damn ye," replied the pirate, "you lie, you dog, but did my be. Your hide shall pay for your roguery, and if I can't bring her off, we'll burn her where she lies." He then ordered Captain Fulker to the gears. No reason, no arguments, could prevail. He was stripped and lashed after a very inhuman manner, and the boat's crew being sent again, with much ado carried her off as far as the bar, where she bilged and sunk. The pirates then endeavored to set what remained of her out of water on fire, but they could not burn her. The Snow getting under sail to look out for some booty, Fulker and the others desired they might be set at liberty, but it was denied them for the present, though not without a promise that they should be released the first vessel they took. The 5th of June they left Carolina, and the next day they spied a sail, which proved the John and Betty, commanded by Captain Gale, bound from Barbados to Guinea. Fly gave chase, but finding the ship wronged him, he made a signal of distress, hoisting his jack at the maintop masthead. But this decoy did not hinder the ship making the best of her way. Fly continued the chase all night, and the wind slackening, he came within shot of the ship, and fired several guns at her under his black ensign, the ship being of no force, and the pirates ready to board. The captain struck, and Fly manning his long boat, which carried a paterotwa in the bow. The crew being well armed with pistols and cutlasses went on board the prize, and sent Captain Gale, after having secured his men, prisoner on board the Snow. This prize was of little value to the pirates, who took nothing but some sail, clothes, and small arms, and after 2 days let her go, but took away 6 of his men, setting on board Captain Fulker and a passenger. Mr. Atkinson was detained, and Captain Green's surgeon. They kept this gentleman, Mr. Dundazigi. Atkinson, knowing he was a good artist, and lately master of the Bonetta brigantine, as a pilot for the coast of New England, which they were satisfied he was well acquainted with. Upon Mr. Atkinson's desiring to have his liberty with the others, Captain Fly made him the following speech. "Look ye, Captain Atkinson, it is not that we care a T.D. for your company. G.D.D. N ye, G.D.D. in my soul, not a T.D. by G.D. And that's fair, but G.D.D. in ye, and G.Z.wool, does B. D and W D.S. If you don't act like an honest man, G.D.D. in ye, and offer to play us any roguesy tricks by G.D. and G.D. sink me, but I'll blow your brains out, C.D.D. and me, if I don't. Now, Captain Atkinson, you may do as you please. You may be a son of a whore and pilot us wrong, which G.D.D. and ye would be a rascally trick by G.D. because you would betray men who trust in you. But, by the eternal J.S., you shan't live to see us hang. I don't love many words. G.D.D. and ye. If you have a mind to be well used, you shall. G.D. But if you will be a villain and betray your trust, may G.D. strike me dead, and may I drink a bowl of brimstone and fire with the D.L. if I don't send you head long to H. L G D D and me, and so there needs no more arguments. By G D, for I've told you my mind, and here's all the ship's crew for witnesses, that if I do blow your brains out, you may blame nobody but yourself. G I tell D D, and ye, Mr. Rell, Atkinson answered. It was very hard he should be forced to take upon him the pilotage, when he did not pretend to know the coast, and that his life should answer for any mistake. His ignorance of the coast might make him guilty of guile, and therefore begged he might be set on board Captain Gale, and that they would trust to their own knowledge, since he did not doubt there being better artists on board. No, no, replied Fly, that won't do by Jishi. Your palavering won't save your bacon. Muchas palabras no valen nada, as the Spaniards say. So either discharge your trust, like an honest man, for go you shan't by Jichtres, or I'll send you with my service to the D. Lel. So no more words, gig. Ni. There was no reply made, and they stood for the coast of New England. Off Delaware Bay they made a sloop, commanded by one Harris, bound from New York to Pennsylvania. She had on board about 50 passengers. Fly gave chase, and coming up with her, hoisted his black ensign, and ordered her to strike, which she immediately did. And Fly sent Captain Atkinson on board with 3 of his hands to sail her, though he would not allow him, Atkinson, any arms. They, the pirates, ransacked this prize, but not finding her of any use to them, after a detention of 24 hours, they let her go, with her men, excepting only a well-made young fellow, whose name was James Benbrook, whom they kept. Fly, after having released the prize, ordered Captain Atkinson to carry the snow into Martha's Vineyard, but he willfully missed this place. Fly, finding himself beyond Nantucket, and that his design was balk, called to Atkinson, and told him he was a rascally son of an envenomed bitch, and his blood, it was a piece of cruelty to let such a son of a whore live, who designed the death of so many honest fellows. Atkinson, in his defense, said he never pretended to know the coast, and that it was very hard he should die for being thought an abler man than he really was. Had he pretended to be their pilot, and did not know his business, he deserved punishment. But when he was forced upon a business which he before declared he did not understand, it would be certainly cruel to make him suffer for their mistake. G. D. D. N. Ye, replied Fly, you are an obstinate villain, and your design is to hang us. But, B. D. N. W. Joe. D.S. you dog. You shan't live to see it. And saying this, he ran into his cabin and fetched a pistol with design to shoot Atkinson. But by the interposition of Mitchell, who thought him innocent of any design, he escaped. Atkinson, who perceived his life every minute in danger, began to ingratiate himself with the pirates, and gave them hopes that with good and gentle usage he might be brought to join them. This he did not say in express terms, but by words he now and then let drop, as by accident. They were not a little rejoiced at the view of having so good an artist to join them. Nay, some of them hinted to him that if he would take upon him the command, they were ready to dispossess Captain Fly, who carried his command too high, and was known to all the crew to be no artist, and to understand nothing beyond the business of a boatswain. Atkinson thought it his interest to keep them in the opinion that he would join, but always declined hearing anything as to the command. This made him less severely used dead, and protected him from the insults of Fly, who imagined he would betray them the first opportunity, and therefore more than once proposed his being thrown overboard, which was never approved by the Snows Company. From Nantucket they stood to the eastward, and off Brown's Bank made a fishing schooner. Fly, coming up with her, fired a gun, and hoisting his black ensign, swore in his blood if they did not instantly bring to and send their boat on board, he would sink her. The schooner obeyed, and sent away her boat on board the Snow. He examined the captain what vessels were to be met with it, and promised, if he could put him in the way of meeting with a good sailor, to let him go, and give him his vessel, or he should otherwise keep her. The poor man told him he had a companion which would soon be in sight, and was a much better vessel. Accordingly, about 12 at noon the same day, which was the 23rd of June, the other schooner hove in sight, upon which Fly manned this prize with 6 pirates, and a prisoner named George Tasker, and sent her in chase, having himself on board the Snow no more than 3 pirates. Captain Atkinson, who had worked himself into some favor with him, and 15 forced men, but he took care to have his arms upon deck by him. The men who had not taken on with Fly were Atkinson, Captain Fulker's mate, and 2 youths belonging to him, the carpenter and gunner belonging formerly to Captain Green, 6 of Captain Gale's men, and the aforesaid Benbrook, who belonged to Captain Harris, with 3 of the men out of the schooner. Atkinson, seeing the prisoners and forced men were 5 to 1 of the pirate, thought of delivering himself from the bondage he was in with, and, as by good luck, several other fishing vessels hove in sight, right ahead of the Snow, he called to Captain Fly, and told him he spied several other vessels ahead, desiring to all he would come forward and bring his glass. Fly did so, and leaving his arms on the quarter deck, sat him on the windlass to see if he could make what they were. Atkinson, who had concerted his measures with one Walker and the above mentioned D. Benbrook, secured the arms on the quarter deck, and gave them a signal to seize Fly, which they did, with very little trouble, and after made themselves masters of the other 3 pirates and the Snow. The rest of the prisoners, not knowing anything of it, or what the design might be, remaining altogether inactive, and they then brought the Snow and pirates to Great Brewster, where a guard was put on board, June 28, 1726. Soon after, the said pirates were brought to their trial, that is, on the 4th of July following, before the Honorable William Dummer, S.Q., Lieutenant Governor and Commander-in-Chief of the Province of Massachusetts Bay, President of the Special Court of Admiralty, held at the Court House of Boston, assisted by 18 gentlemen of the Council, before whom they were found guilty of murder and piracy, condemned to be executed, and accordingly were executed the 12th of July. Fly was ordered to be hanged in chains at the entrance of the harbor of Boston. Thus ended the short reign of the obdurate wretch, who only wanted skill and power to be as infamous as any who had scoured the seas. The names of the 3 pirates executed with him were Samuel Cole, George Condick, and Henry Greenville. Chapter 17. Appendix to the first volume. We have already touched upon the history of some of the pirates, which we shall have occasion to name here over again. But since the printing our first volume, the following relations are fallen into our hands. which being much more curious and particular than anything hitherto made public upon these affairs, we are satisfied our readers will find their entertainment in the perusal of it. About the 20th of July, 1718, Mr. Woodes Rogers, Governor and Vice Admiral of the Bahama Islands, being sent from England with the King's proclamation, and pardon for all pirates who had surrendered by a time specified in the said proclamation, arrived at Providence. It was evening when the fleet came off the town of Nassau in the said island, when Richard Turnley, the pilot, who was on board the Delicia, did not judge it safe to venture over the bar that night, wherefore it was resolved to lie by till morning. In the meantime, there came some men on board the fleet from off a little island, called Harbor Island, adjacent to Providence. The advice they brought was, that there were near 1,000 pirates on shore upon the island of Providence, waiting for the King's pardon, which had been long expected. The principal of their commanders were Benj, Hornigold, Arthur Davis, Joe Style, Burgess though, Carty, and they were all in or about the town of Nassau. That the fort was extremely out of repair, there being only one gun mounted, a 9-pounder, and no accommodation for men, but one little hut or house, which was inhabited by an old fellow, whom the pirates, in derision, called Governor Sawney. The fleet was seen from the harbor, as well as the town, so that Captain Charles Vane, who had no design of surrendering, but, on the contrary, had fitted out his ship with a resolution of attempting new adventures, took the advantage of the night to contrive his escape, and though the harbor was blocked up, and his ship drew too much water to get out by Tether East Passage, he shifted his hands, and things of most value, into a lighter vessel, and charging all the guns of the ship he quitted with double, round and partridge, he set it on fire, imagining that some of the ships, or their boats, might be sent near him, and he might do some mischief when it should burn down to them. Those in the fleet saw the light, and heard the guns, and fancied the pirates on shore were making bonfires, and firing guns for joy that the King's free pardon was arrived, and Captain Whitney, commander of the Rose man of war, sent his boat with his lieutenant on shore, which was intercepted by Vane, who carried the crew on board, and stripped them of some stores they had in the boat. He kept them till he got under sail, which was till day break, when there was light enough for him to see how to steer his way through the East Passage, which was no sooner done but he hoisted a black flag, and fired a gun, and then let the lieutenant and boat's crew depart and join the fleet. The fleet got safe into the harbor, and as soon as the lieutenant arrived on board, and related what had passed, the buck sloop was ordered to chase Vane. She made what sail she could throw the East Passage after him, having a recruit of men well armed sent to her from the other ships, but being heavily loaden with rich goods, Vane had the heels of her, which the Commodore observing, made a signal for her to leave off the chase, and return, which she did accordingly. They immediately fell to mooring and securing their ships, which took up the time till night. Next morning the governor went on shore, being received at his landing by the principal people in the government of the place, as Thomas Walker, S.Q., Chief Justice, and Thomas Taylor, S.Q., President of the Council. The pirate captains, Hornigold, Davis, Carter, Burgess, Courant, Clark, with some others, drew up their crews in 2 lines, reaching from the water side to the fort, the governor and other officers marching between them. In the meantime, they being under arms, made a running fire over his head. Being arrived at the fort, his commission was opened and read, and he was sworn in governor of the island according to form. The next day the governor made out a commission to Richard Turnley, the chief pilot, to Mr. Bible Hole, Salter, a factor, and some others, to go on board and examine all suspected ships and vessels in the harbor, to take an inventory of their several ladings, and to secure both ship and cargo for the use of the king and company, till such time as a court of admiralty could be called, that they might be lawfully cleared or condemned by proving which belonged to pirates, and which to fair traders. The day following a court martial was held, in which a military discipline was settled, in order to prevent surprises, both from Spaniards and pirates, till such time as the fort could be repaired, and put into a condition of defense. For this purpose, the governor was obliged to make use of some of the pardoned pirates, such as Hornigold, Davis, and Burgess, to whom he gave some commands, and George Featherston, James Bonney, and Dennis McCarty, with some other pirates of a lower rank, acted under them as inferior officers. Soon after, the civil government was also settled, some of the principal officers being appointed justices of the peace, others of inferior degree, constables and overseers of the ways and roads, which were overgrown with bushes and underwood, all about the town of Nassau, so that if any enemy had landed in the night, they might lie in ambuscade in those covers, and surprise the town. Wherefore several of the common pirates were employed in clearing away the said bushes and underwood. The governor, with some soldiers, guarded the fort, and the inhabitants, who were formed into train bands, took care of the town. But as there was no sort of accommodation to lodge such a number of people, they were forced to unbend the sails, and bring them on shore, in order to make tents, till they had time to build houses, which was done with all possible expedition, by a kind of architecture altogether new. Those that were built in the fort were done by making 6 little holes in the rock, at convenient distances, in each of which was stuck a forked pole. On these, from one to t'other, were placed cross poles or rafters, which being lathed at top, and on the sides, with small sticks, were afterwards covered with palmata leaves, and then the house was finished, for they did not much trouble themselves about the ornaments of doors and windows. In the meantime, the repairing the fort was carried on, and the streets were ordered to be kept clean, both for health and conveniency, so that it began to have the appearance of a civilized place. A proclamation was published for the encouragement of all such persons who should be willing to settle upon the island of Providence, by which every person was to have a lot of ground of 120 foot square, anywhere in or about the town of Nassau, that was not before in the possession of others, provided they should clear the said ground, and build a house tenantable, by a certain time therein limited, which might be easily done, as they might have timber for nothing. This had the effect proposed, and a great many immediately fell to work to comply with the conditions, in order to settle themselves there. Many of the pirates were employed in the woods in cutting down sticks to make palisados, and all the people belonging to the ships, officers excepted, were obliged to work 4 days in the week upon the fortification, so that in a short time a strong entrenchment was cast round the fort, and being well palisaded, it rendered the fort tolerably strong. But it did not much suit the inclinations of the pirates to be set to work, and though they had provisions sufficient, and had also a good allowance of wine and brandy to each man, yet they began to have such a hankering after their old trade, that many of them took opportunities of seizing petiogas and other boats in the night, and making their escapes, so that in a few months there was not many of them left. However, when the Spanish War was proclaimed, several of them returned back again of their own accord, being tempted with the hopes of being employed upon the privateering account, which is something like pirating, for that place lying near the coast of Spanish America, and also not far from the Gulf of Florida, seemed to be a good station for intercepting the Spanish vessels going to Old Spain. They were not mistaken in this supposition, for the governor, according to the power vested in him, did grant commissions for privateering, and made choice of some of the principal pirates who had continued upon the island, in obedience to the pardon, for commanders, as being persons well qualified for such employments, who made up their crews chiefly of their scattered companions, who were newly returned upon the hopes of preferment. About this time a fishing vessel belonging to the island of Providence brought in the master of a ship, and a few sailors, whom she had picked up at sea in a canoe. The said master was called Captain King, who sailed in a ship called the Neptune, belonging to South Carolina, loaden with rice, pitch, tar, and other merchandises, bound for London. The account he gave of himself was that he was met with by Charles Vane the pirate, who carried him into Green Turtle Bay, one of the Bahama Islands, by whom he was plundered of a great part of his cargo, which consisting chiefly of stores, was of great use to them, that afterwards they cut away part of one of the masts of the ship, and fired a gun down her hold, with a design of sinking her, that they took some of his men into their service, and when they were sailing off, gave him and the rest a canoe to save themselves, that with this canoe they made shift to sail from one little island to another, till they had the good luck to meet the fishing boat which took them up, and that he believed Charles Vane might still be cruising thereabouts. Upon this intelligence, the governor fitted out a ship, which was named the Willing Mind, manned with 50 stout hands, well armed, and also a sloop with 30 hands, which he sent to cruise amongst those islands, in search of Vane, the pirate, giving them orders also to endeavor to recover the ship Neptune, which Captain King told them had still goods of a considerable value left in her. They went out accordingly, but never saw Vane. However, they found the Neptune, which was not sunk as the pirates intended, for the ball they fired into her stuck in the ballista, without passing through, by reason the gun had not been sufficiently charged, and so they returned with her about the 10th of November. But an unlucky accident happened to the ship Willing Mind, occasioned either by the ignorance or carelessness of the pilot, which was bulged in going over the bar. In the meantime Vane made towards the coast of Hispaniola, living riotously on board, having store of liquor, and plenty of fresh provisions, such as hogs, goats, sheep, fowl, which he got upon easy terms, for touching at a place called Isle Leatherer, Eleuthera, he plundered the inhabitants of as much of their provision as they could carry away. Here they cruised to about February, when, near the windward passage of Cape Maisie, they met with a large rich ship of London, called the Kingston, loaden with bale goods, and other rich merchandise, and having several passengers on board, some English, and some Jews, besides 2 women. Towards the north end of Jamaica, they also met with a turtle sloop, bound in for that island, on board of which, after having first plundered her, they put the captain of the Kingston, and some of his men, and all the passengers, except the 2 women, whom they kept for their own entertainment, contrary to the usual practice of pirates, who generally sent them away, lest they should occasion contention. The ship Kingston they kept for their own use, for now, their company being strengthened by a great many recruits, some volunteers, and some forced men out of the Neptune and Kingston, they thought they had hands enough for 2 ships. Accordingly they shifted several of their hands on board the Kingston, and John Rackham, alias Calico Jack, so called, because his jackets and drawers were always made of calico. Quarters, Master Vane, was unanimously chosen captain of the Kingston. The empire of these pirates had not been long thus divided before they had like to have fallen into a civil war amongst themselves, which must have ended in the destruction of one of them. The fatal occasion of the difference betwixt these two brother adventurers was this. It happened that Vane's liquor was all out, who sending to his brother captain for a supply. Rackham accordingly spared him what he thought fit, but it falling short of Vane's expectation as to quantity, he went on board of Rackham's ship to expostulate the matter with him, so that words arising, Rackham threatened to shoot him through the head if he did not immediately return to his own ship, and told him likewise that if he did not sheer off and part company, he would sink him. Vane thought it best to take his advice, for he thought the other was bold enough to be as good as his word, for he had it in his power to be so, his ship being the largest and strongest of the two. Accordingly, they parted, and Rackham made for the island of Princes, and having great quantities of rich goods on board, taken in the late prizes, they were divided into lots, and he and his crew shared them by throwing dice, the highest cast being to choose first. When they had done, they packed up their goods in casks, and buried them on shore in the island of Princes, that they might have room for fresh booty. In the meantime, it happened that a turtle sloop belonging to Jamaica came in there. Rackham sent his boat, and brought the master on board of him, and asking him several questions, the master informed him that war with Spain had been proclaimed in Jamaica, and that the time appointed by the general pardon for pirates to surrender, in order to receive the benefit thereof, was not expired. Upon this intelligence Rackham and his crew suddenly changed their minds, and were resolved to take the benefit of the pardon by a speedy surrender. Wherefore, instead of using the master ill, as the poor man expected, they made him several presents, desiring him to sail back to Jamaica, and acquaint the governor they were willing to surrender, provided he would give his word and honor they should have the benefit of the pardon, which, as extensive as it was, they apprehended they were not entitled to, because they had run away in defiance of it at Providence. They desired the master also to return with the governor's answer, assuring him he should be no loser by the voyage. The master very willingly undertook the commission, and arriving at Jamaica, delivered his message to the governor, according to his instructions. But it happened that the master of the Kingston, with his passengers, being come to Jamaica, had acquainted the governor with the piracies of Vane and Rackham, before the Turtler got thither, who was actually fitting out 2 sloops, which were now just ready, in pursuit of them, so that the governor was very glad to discover, by the Turtler's message, where Rackham was to be found. The 2 sloops, well manned, accordingly sailed out, and found Rackham in the station where the Turtler had described him, but altogether in disorder, and quite unprepared, either for sailing or for fight, most of his sails being on shore erected into tent set, and his decks lumbered with goods. He happened to be on board himself, though most of his men were ashore, and seeing the 2 sloops at a distance, bearing towards him, he observed them with his glass, and fancied he saw on board something like preparations for fighting. This was what he did not expect, for he looked for no enemy, and while he was in doubt and suspense about them, they came so near that they began to fight. He had neither time nor means to prepare for defense, so that there was nothing to be done but to run into his boat, and escape to the shore, which he did accordingly with the few hands he had with him, leaving the 2 women on board to be taken by the enemy. The sloop seized the ship Kingston, manned her, and brought her into Jamaica, having still a great part of her cargo left. When she arrived, The master of her fell to examining what part of the cargo was lost, and what left. He searched also for his bills of lading and cocketship, too, but they were all destroyed by Rackham, so that the ship being freighted by several owners, the master could not tell whose property was saved, and whose lost, till he had fresh bills of parcels of each owner from England. There was one remarkable piece of good luck which happened in this affair. There were, amongst other goods, 60 gold watches on board, and 30 of silver. The pirates divided the silver watches, but the gold being packed up amongst some bale goods, were never discovered by them, and the master, in searching, found them all safe. In the meantime, Rackham and his crew lived in the woods, in very great suspense what to do with themselves. They had with them ammunition and small arms, and also some of the goods, such as bales of silk stockings and laced hats, with which, it is supposed, they intended to make themselves fine. They had also 2 boats and a canoe, being divided in their resolutions. Rackham with 6 more determined to take one of the boats, and make the best of their way for the island of Providence, and there claim the benefit of the king's pardon, which they fancied they might be entitled to, by representing that they were carried away by Vane, against their wills. Accordingly they put some arms, ammunition, and provision into the best boat, and also some of the goods, and so set sail. They first made the island of Pines. From thence got over to the north side of Cuba, where they destroyed several Spanish boats and launches. One they took, which being a stout sea-boat, they shifted themselves and their cargo into her, and sunk their own, and then stretched over to the island of Providence, where they landed safely about the middle of May, 1719, where, demanding the king's pardon, the governor thought fit to allow it them, and certificates were granted to them accordingly. Here they sold their goods and spent the money merrily. When all was gone, some engaged themselves in privateers, and others in trading vessels. But Rackham, as captain, having a much larger share than any of the rest, his money held out a little longer, but happening about this time to come acquainted with Anne Bonny, that made him very extravagant. Anne Bonny, as has been taken notice of in the first volume, was married to James Bonny, one of the pardoned pirates, a likely young fellow, and of a sober life, considering he had been a pirate. But Anne, who was very young, soon turned a libertine upon his hands, so that he once surprised her lying in a hammock with another man. Rackham made his addresses to her till his money was all spent, but as he found there was no carrying on an amour with empty pockets up, he engaged himself with Captain Burgess, lately a pirate, but pardoned, who had received a commission to privateer upon the Spaniards. This cruise proved successful. They took several prizes, amongst the rest, 2 of considerable value, one loaden with cocoa-nut, and another with sugar. They brought them into Providence, and found purchasers amongst the factors, who came from other places for that purpose. The dividend was considerable, and as soon as possible disposed of, Burgess sailed out in quest of new purchase. But Rackham, who had nothing but Anne Bonny in his head, stayed behind to spend his money, and enjoy his mistress. Rackham lived in all manner of luxury, spending his money liberally upon Anne Bonny, who was so taken with his generosity that she had the assurance to propose to her husband to quit him, in order to cohabit with John Rackham, and that Rackham should give him a sum of money. In consideration he should resign her to the said Rackham by a writing in form, and she even spoke to some persons to witness the said writing. The story made some noise, so that the governor, hearing of it, sent for her and one Anne Fulworth, who came with her from Carolina, and passes for her mother, and was privy to all her loose behavior. and examining them both upon it, and finding they could not deny it, he threatened if they proceeded further in it, to commit them both to prison, and order them to be whipped, and that Rackham himself should be their executioner. These menaces made her promise to be very good, to live with her husband, and to keep loose company no more. But all this was dissimulation, for Rackham and she consulting together, and finding they could not by fair means enjoy each other's company with freedom, resolved to run away together, and enjoy it in spite of all the world. To this purpose they plotted together to seize a sloop which then lay in the harbor, and Rackham drew some brisk young fellows into the conspiracy. They were of the number of the pirates lately pardoned, and who, he knew, were weary of working on shore, and longed to be again at their old trade. The sloop they made choice of was betwixt 30 and 40 ton, and one of the swiftest sailors that ever was built of that kind. She belonged to one John Hammond, who lived upon a little island not far from Providence, which was inhabited by no human creature except himself and his family. For he had a wife and children. His livelihood and constant employment was to plunder and pillage the Spaniards, whose sloops and launches he had often surprised about Cuba and Hispaniola, and sometimes brought off a considerable booty, always escaping by a good pair of heels, insomuch that it become a by-word to say, "There goes John Hammond. Catch him if you can." His business to Providence now was to bring his family there, in order to live and settle, being weary, perhaps, of living in that solitude, or else apprehensive if any of the Spaniards should discover his habitation, they might land, and be revenged of him for all his pranks. Anne Bonny was observed to go several times on board this sloop. She pretended to have some business with John Hammond. Therefore she always went when he was on shore, for her true errand was to discover how many hands were aboard, and what kind of watch they kept, and to know the passages and ways of the vessel. She discovered as much as was necessary. She found there were but 2 hands on board, that John Hammond lay on shore every night. She inquired of them whether they watched, where they lay, and asked many other questions, to all which they readily answered her, as thinking she had no design but common curiosity. Captain Woods Rogers and his family. A painting by William Hogarth in the Portrait Gallery of the National Maritime Museum, Greenwich. She acquainted Rackham with every particular, who resolved to lose no time, and therefore, acquainting his associates, who were 8 in number, they appointed an hour for meeting at night, which was at 12 o'clock. They were all true to the roguery, and Anne Bonny was as punctual as the most resolute, and being all well armed, they took a boat and rowed to the sloop, which was very near the shore. The night seemed to favor the attempt, for it was both dark and rainy. As soon as they got on board, Anne Bonny, having a drawn sword in one hand and a pistol in the other, attended by one of the men, went straight to the cabin where the 2 fellows lay, who belonged to the sloop. The noise waked them, which she observing, swore that, if they pretended to resist, or make a noise, she would blow out their brains. That was the term she used. In the meantime, Rackham and the rest were busy heaving in the cables, one of which they soon got up, and down. For expedition's sake, they slipped the other, and so drove down the harbor. They passed pretty near the fort, which hailed them, as did also the guardship, asking them where they were going. They answered, their cable had parted, and that they had nothing but a grappling on board, which would not hold them. Immediately after which they put out a small sail, just to give them steerage way. When they came to the harbor's mouth, and thought they could not be seen by any of the ships, because of the darkness of the night, they hoisted all the sail they had, and stood to sea. Then, calling up the 2 men, They asked them if they would be of their party, but finding them not inclined, they gave them a boat to row themselves ashore, ordering them to give their service to Haman, and to tell him they would send him his sloop again when they had done with it. Rackham and Anne Bonny both bore great spleen to one Richard Turnley, whom Anne had asked to be a witness to the writing, which James Bonny, her husband, was to give to Rackham, by which she was to be resigned to him. Turnley refused his hand upon that occasion, and was the person who acquainted the governor with the story, for which they vowed revenge against him. He was gone from Providence a-turtling before they made their escape, and they, knowing what island he was upon, made to the place. They saw the sloop about a league from the shore, fishing, and went aboard with 6 hands. But Turnley, with his boy, by good luck, happened to be ashore salting some wild hogs they killed the day before. They inquired for him, and hearing where he was, rowed ashore in search of him. Turnley from the land saw the sloop boarded, and observed the men afterwards making for the shore, and being apprehensive of pirates, which are very common in those parts, he, with his boy, fled into a neighboring wood. The surf was very great, so that they could not bring the boat to shore. They waded up to the armpits, and Turnley, peeping through the trees, saw them bring arms on shore. Upon the whole, not liking their appearance, he, with his boy, lay snug in the bushes. When they had looked about, and could not see him, they hollowed, and called him by his name. But he not appearing, they thought it time lost to look for him in such a wilderness, and therefore they returned to their boat, but rowed again back to the sloop, and took away the sails, and several other things. They also carried away with them 3 of the hands, viz., Richard Connor the mate, John Davis, and John Howell, but rejected David Soward the 4th hand, though he had been an old experienced pirate, because he was lame and disabled by a wound he had formerly received. When they had done thus much, they cut down the main mast, and towing the vessel into deep water, sunk her. Having first put David Soward into a boat to shift for himself, he made shift to get ashore, and after some time, having found out Turnley, he told him that Rackham and Anne Bonny were determined, if they could have found him, to have whipped him to death, as he heard them vow, with many bitter oaths and imprecations. For whipping was the punishment the governor had threatened her with by his information. From thence they stretched over to the Berry Islands, plundering all the sloops they met, and strengthening their company with several additional hands, and so went on till they were taken and executed at Port Royal, as has been told in the 1st volume. About this time, the governor, in conjunction with some factors then residing at Providence, thought fit to freight some vessels for a trading voyage. Accordingly, the Bachelor's Adventure, a schooner, Captain Henry White, commander; the Lancaster sloop, Captain William Greenaway, commander; the Mary sloop, Captain John Augur, commander, of which last David Soward was owner, it having been given him by some pirates, his former associates, in which he also sailed this voyage, were fitted out with a cargo of goods and merchandises, bound for Port Prince on the island of Cuba. The governor thought it advisable, for the benefit of the inhabitants of Providence, to settle a correspondence with some merchants at Port Prince. First, in order to procure fresh provisions, there being scarce any upon the island at the governor's first arrival, and there being at Port Prince great plenty of cows and hogs, he proposed to get a sufficient number of each, to stock the island for breed, that the people for the future might have fresh provision of their own. They set sail on Sunday the 5th of October 1718. The next day they arrived at an island known by the name of Green Key, lying southeast from Providence, in the degree of 23, and 40 north latitude, being distance about 25 leagues. They cast anchor, in order to wait for morning to carry them through some rocks and shoals which lay in their way. And some went ashore to try to kill something for supper, before it should be dark. They expected to meet some wild hogs, for some time before, one Joseph Bay and one Sims put 2 sows and a boar into the said island, for they living at that time at Providence, and being continually visited by pirates, were always plundered of all their fresh provisions. Wherefore, they thought of settling a breed upon Green Key, that they might have recourse to in time of necessity. This island is about 9 miles in circumference, and about 3 miles broad in the widest place. It is overgrown with wild cabbage and palmata trees, and great variety of other herbs and fruits, so that there is plenty of food for the nourishment of such animals. But the trees lying so close together makes it but bad hunting, so that they killed but one hog, which, however, was of a monstrous size. The hunters returned on board their ships again before 7, having first divided the hog, and sent part on board each vessel for supper that night. After supper, Captain Greenaway and Captain White came on board of Captain Augur's sloop, in order to consult together what time to sail, and being all of opinion, that if they weighed anchor betwixt the hours of 10 and 11, it would be day before they would come up with the shoals. They agreed upon that hour for setting sail, and so returned to their own vessels. Soon after, Phineas Bunce and Dennis McCarty, with a great many others, came from White's sloop on board of Augur's. Their pretense was that they came to see Richard Turnley and Mr. Brooke. James Carr, who had formerly been a midshipman in the Roseman of War under Captain Whitney, and being a great favorite of Governor Rogers, he had appointed him supercargo this voyage. They desired to be treated with a bottle of beer, for they knew Mr. Carr had some that was very good in his care, which had been put on board in order to make presents of, and to treat the Spanish merchants with. As it was not suspected they had anything else in view, Mr. Carr readily went down, and brought up a couple of bottles of beer. They sat upon the poop with Captain Augur in their company, and were drinking their beer. Before the second bottle was out, Bunce and McCarty began to rattle, and talk with great pleasure, and much boasting of their former exploits when they had been pirates, crying up a pirate's life to be the only life for a man of any spirit. While they were running on in this manner, Bunce on a sudden started up, and swore, damn him, he would be captain of that vessel. Augur answered him, the vessel did not want a captain, for he was able to command her himself, which seemed to put an end to the discourse for that time. Soon after, Bunce began to tell what bright arms they had on board their sloop, upon which one of Augur's men handed up some of their cutlashes which had been cleaned that day. Among them was Mr. Carr's silver-hilted sword. Bunce seemed to admire the sword, and asked whose it was. Mr. Carr made answer it belonged to him. Bunce replied it was a very handsome one, and drawing it out, marched about the poop, flourishing it over his head, and telling Mr. Carr he would return it to him as soon as he had done with it. At the same time, he began to vapor again, and to brag of his former piracies, and coming near Mr. Carr struck him with the sword. Turnley bid him take care of what he did, for that Mr. Carr would not take such usage. As they were disputing upon this matter, Dennis McCarty stole off, and with some of his associates seized upon the great cabin where all the arms lay. At the same time, several of the men began to sing a song, with these words, "Did not you promise me that you would marry me?" which it seems was the signal agreed upon among the conspirators for seizing the ship. Bunce no sooner heard them, but he cried out aloud, "By G.D., that will I, for I am parson," and struck Mr. Carr again several blows with his own sword, Mr. G. Carr and Turnley both seized him, and they began to struggle, when Dennis McCarty, with several others, returned from the cabin with each a cutlash in one hand, and a loaded pistol in the other, and running up to them said, "What? Do the governor's dogs offer to resist?" And beating Turnley and Carr with their cutlashes, threatened to shoot them, at the same time firing their pistols close to their cheeks, upon which Turnley and Carr begged their lives. When they were thus in possession of the vessel, they hallooed Captain Greenaway, and desired him to come on board about earnest business. He, knowing nothing of what had passed, takes his boat, and only with 2 hands rows on board of them. As soon as he was come, Dennis McCarty leads him into the cabin, and, as soon as he was there, lays hold of him, telling him he was now a prisoner, and must submit. He offered to make some resistance, upon which they told him all resistance would be vain, for his own men were in the plot. And, indeed, he saw the 2 hands which rowed him aboard, now armed, and joining with the conspirators, wherefore he thought it was time to submit. As soon as this was done, they sent some hands on board to seize his sloop, or rather to acquaint his men with what had been done, for they expected to meet with no resistance, many of them being in the plot, and the rest, they supposed, not very averse to it. After which, they decoyed Captain White on board, by the same stratagem they used to Greenaway, and likewise sent on board his sloop, and found his men, one and all, well disposed for the design. And what was most remarkable was, that Captain Augur, seeing how things were going, joined with them, shewing himself as well inclined for pirating as the worst of them. Thus they made themselves masters of the 3 vessels, with very little trouble. The next thing to be done was to resolve how to dispose of those who were not of their party. Some were for killing Richard Turnley, but the majority carried it for marooning, that he might be starved, and die like a dog, as they called it. Their great spleen to him was, because he was the person who had piloted the governor into Providence. Accordingly, Turnley, with John Carr, Thomas Rich, and some others, were stripped naked, and tumbled over the vessel's side into a boat which lay alongside. The oars were all taken out, and they left them nothing to work themselves ashore with but an old paddle, which at other times served to steer the boat, and so they commanded them to be gone. However, they made shift to get safe ashore to the island, which, as we observed before, was quite uninhabited. The next morning, Dennis McCarty, with several others, went on shore and told them they must come on board again, and they would give them some clothes to put on. They fancied the pirates began to repent of the hard usage they had given them, and were willing to return upon such an errand. But when they got on board again, they found their opinion of the pirates' good nature was very ill-grounded, for they began with beating them, and did it as if it were in sport, one having a boatswain's pipe, the rest beating them till he piped belay. The true design of bringing them on board again was to make them discover where some things lay, which they could not readily find, as particularly Mr. J. Carr's watch and silver snuff box, but he was soon obliged to inform them in what corner of the cabin they lay, and there they were found, with some journals and other books, which they knew how to make no other use of but by turning into cartridges. Then they began to question Thomas Rich about a gold watch which had once been seen in his possession on shore at Providence, but he protested that it belonged to Captain Gale, who was commander of the god ship called the Delicia, to which he then belonged, but his protestations would have availed him little, had it not been that some on board who belonged also to the Delicia knew it to be true, which put an end to his beating, and so they were all discharged from their punishment for the present. Some time after, fancying the pirates to be in better humor, they begged for something to eat, for they had none of them had any nourishment that day or the night before. But all the answer they received was, that such dogs should not ask such questions. In the meantime, some of the pirates were very busy endeavoring to persuade Captain Greenaway to engage with them, for they knew him to be an excellent artist. But he was obstinate and would not. Then it was proposed what should be done with him, and the word went for marooning, which was opposed by someone because he was a Bermudian, meaning that he might perhaps swim away, or swim on board his vessel again, for the Bermudians are all excellent swimmers. But as he represented that he could not hurt them by his swimming, he obtained the favor for himself and the other officers, to be set ashore with Turnley, Carey, and Rich. Accordingly, they were put into the same boat without oars, to the number of 8, and were ordered to make the best of their way on shore. The pirates, the next day, having examined all their vessels, and finding that Greenaway's sloop was not fit for their purpose, shifted everything out of it. Those that were sent on shore could see from thence what they were doing, and when they saw them row off, Greenaway swam on board the sloop. It is likely to see whether they had left anything behind them. They perceived him, and fancied he repented his refusing to join with them, and was come to do it now. Wherefore some of them returned back to the sloop, to speak to him, but they found him of the same opinion he was in before. However, he wheedled them into so much good humor, that they told him he might have his sloop again, in which, indeed, they had left nothing except an old main sail, an old fore sail, 4 small pieces of Irish beef, in an old beef barrel, and about 20 biscuits, with a broken bucket which was used to draw water in it, telling him that he and the rest must not go on board till they were sailed. Greenaway swam ashore again to give notice to his brothers in distress of what had passed. The same afternoon Bunce with several others went on shore, carrying with them 6 bottles of wine and some biscuits. Whether this was done to tempt Greenaway again, or no, is hard to say, for though they talked to him a great deal, they drank all the wine themselves to the last bottle, and then they gave each of the poor creatures a glass apiece, with a bit of biscuit, and immediately after fell a beating them in, and so went on board. While they were on shore, there came in a turtler which belonged to one Thomas Bennet of Providence, whereof one Benjamin Hutchins was master. They soon laid hold of her, for she went excellently well. Hutchins was reputed an extraordinary good pilot among those islands, wherefore they tempted him to engage with them. At first he refused, but rather than be marooned, he afterwards consented. It was now the 9th of October, and they were just preparing to sail, when they sent on shore, ordering the condemned malefactors to come on board of the Lancaster. That was Greenaway's sloop. They did so in the little boat they went on shore in L. By the help of the same paddle, they found several of the pirates there, who told them that they gave them that sloop to return to Providence, though they let them have no more stores than what were named before. They bid them take the fore sail, and bend it for a jib, and furl it close down to the bolt, sprit, and to furl the main sail close up upon the boom. They did as they were ordered, for they knew there was no disputing whether it was right or wrong. Soon after, another detachment came on board, among which were Bunce and Dennis McCarty, who, being either mad or drunk, fell upon them, beating them, and cutting the rigging and sails to pieces with their cutlashes, and commanding them not to sail till they should hear from them again, cursing and damning. If they did, they would put them all to death. if ever they met them again. And so they went off, carrying with them the boat, which they sent them first ashore in Terra, and sailed away. They left them in this miserable condition without tackle to go their voyage, and without a boat to get on shore, and having nothing in view but to perish for want. But as self-preservation put them upon exerting themselves, in order to get out of this deplorable state, they began to rummage and search the vessel through every hole and corner, to see if nothing was left which might be of use to them. And it happened by chance that they found an old hatchet, with which they cut some sticks sharp to serve for marlin spikes. They also cut out several other things, to serve instead of such tools as are absolutely necessary on board a ship. When they had proceeded thus far, every man began to work as hard as he could. They cut a piece of cable, which they strung into rope yarns, and fell to mend their sails with all possible expedition. They also made a kind of fishing lines of the said rope yarns, and bent some nails crooked to serve for hooks. But as they were destitute of a boat, as well for the use of fishing as for going on shore, they resolved to make a bark log, that is, to lay 2 or 3 logs together, and tie them close, upon which 2 or 3 men may sit very safely in smooth water. As soon as this was done, some hands went on shore, upon one of the said logs, for they made 2 of them, who employed themselves in cutting wild cabbage, gathering berries, and a fruit which the seamen call prickly pears, for food, while some others went a-fishing upon another. Those who went ashore also carried the old bucket with them, so that whilst some were busy in gathering things to serve for provision, one hand was constantly employed in bringing fresh water aboard in the said bucket, which was tedious work, considering how little could be brought at a time, and that the sloop lay near a mile from the shore. When they had employed themselves thus for about 4 or 5 days, they brought their sails and tackle into such order, having also a little water, cabbage, and other things on board, that they thought it was time to venture to sail. Accordingly they weighed their anchor, and putting out all the sail they had, got out to the harbor's mouth, when to their great terror and surprise, they saw the pirates coming in again. They were much frightened at the pirates' unexpected return, because of the threatenings they had used to them at parting, not to sail without further orders. Wherefore they tacked about, and ran as close into the shore as they could. Then, throwing out their bark logs, they all put themselves upon them, and made to land, as fast as they could work. But before they quite reached it, the pirates got so near that they fired at them, but were too far to do execution. However, they pursued them ashore. The poor fugitives immediately took to the woods, and for greater security climbed up some trees, whose branches were very thick, and by that means concealed themselves. The pirates, not finding them, soon returned to their boat, and rowed on board the deserted sloop, whose mast and bolt sprit they cut away, and towing her into deep water, sunk her, after which they made again for the shore, thinking that the fugitives would have been come out of their lurking holes, and that they should surprise them. But they continued still on the tops of their trees and saw all that pass, and therefore thought it safest to keep their posts. The pirates, not finding them, returned to their vessels, and weighing their anchors, set sail, steering eastward. In the meantime, the poor fugitives were in despair, for seeing their vessels sunk, they had scarce any hopes left of escaping the danger of perishing upon that uninhabited island. There they lived 8 days, feeding upon berries and shell fish, such as cockles and periwinkles, sometimes catching a stingray, a fish resembling mead or thornback, which coming into shoal water, they could wade near them, and by the help of a stick sharpened at the end, which they did by rubbing it against the rock, for they had not a knife left amongst them. They struck them as if it had been with a spear. It must be observed that they had no means of striking a fire, and therefore their way of dressing this fish was by dipping it often in salt water, then laying it in the sun, till it became both hard and dry, and then they eat it. After passing 8 days in this manner, the pirates returned, and saw the poor fugitives ashore, who, according to custom, made to the woods. But their hearts began to relent towards them, and sending ashore, they ordered a man to go into the woods single, to call out to them, and promise them upon their honor, if they would appear, that they would give them victuals and drink, and not use them ill any more. These promises, and the hunger which pinched them, tempted them to come forth, and accordingly they went on board with them. And they were as good as their words, for they gave them as much beef and biscuit as they could eat. During 2 or 3 days they were on board, but would not give them a bit to carry on shore. They also gave them 3 or 4 blankets amongst them, to cover their nakedness, for as we observed, they were quite naked, and let them have some needles and thread, to make them into some form. There was on board one George Redding, an inhabitant of Providence, who was taken out of the Turtle sloop, and who was a forced man. Being an acquaintance of Richard Turnley, and knowing that he was resolved to go ashore again, rather than engage with the pirates, and hearing him say that they could find food to keep them alive, if they had but fire to dress it, privately gave him a tinder box, with materials in it for striking fire, which, in his circumstances, was a greater present than gold or jewel. Soon after, the pirates put the question to them, whether they would engage or be put ashore, and they all agreed upon the latter, upon which a debate arose amongst the pirates, whether they should comply with their request or no. And at length it was agreed that Greenaway and the other 2 masters should be kept, whether they would or no, and the rest, being 5 in number, should, as the pirates expressed it, have a second refreshment of the varieties of the isle. Accordingly, Richard Turnley, James Caw, Thomas Rich, John Cox, and John Taylor were a second time marooned, and the pirates, as soon as they landed them, sailed off, steering eastward, till they came to an island called Puddin Point, near Long Island in the latitude of 24, where they cleaned their vessels. In the meantime, Turnley and his companions made a much better shift than they had done before, his friend George Redding's present being of infinite use to them, for they constantly kept a good fire, with which they broiled their fish. There were plenty of land crabs and snakes in the island, which they could eat when they were dressed, and thus they passed 14 days, at the end of which the pirates made them another visit, and they according to custom made for the woods, thinking that the reason of their return must be in order to force them to serve amongst them. But here they were mistaken, for the anger of these fellows being over, they began to pity them, and came now with a design to succor them. But going ashore, and not finding them, they knew they were hid for fear. Nevertheless, they left upon the shore, where they knew they would come, some stores which they intended in this fit of good humor to present them with. The poor islanders were got to their retreat, the tops of the trees, and saw the pirates go off, upon which they ventured down, and going to the water side, were agreeably surprised to find a small cask of flour, of betwixt 20 and 30 pounds, about a bushel of salt, 2 bottles of gunpowder, several bullets, besides a quantity of small shot, with a couple of muskets, a very good axe, and also a pot and a pan, and 3 dogs. which they took in the turtle sloop, which dogs are bred to hunting, and generally the sloops which go turtling carry some of them, as they are very useful in tracing out the wild hogs. Besides all these, there were a dozen horn-handled knives, of that sort which are usually carried to Guinea. They carried all these things into the wood, to that part where they had their fresh water, and where they usually slept, and immediately went to work with their axe, some cutting down boughs, and making poles, so that 4 of them were employed in building a hut, while Richard Turnley, taking the dogs and a gun, went a-hunting, he understanding that sport very well. He had not been gone long before he killed a large boar, which he brought home to his companions, who fell to cutting it up, and some they dressed for their dinner, and the rest they salted, for another time. Thus they lived, as they thought, very happy, in respect to their former condition. But after 4 days, the pirates made them another visit, for they wanted to fill some casks with water. It happened when they came in, that Turnley was gone a-hunting, and the rest all busy at some work, so that they did not see them, till they just came into the wood upon them. Seeing a hut, one of them in wantonness set it on fire, and it was burnt to the ground, and they appeared inclined to do mischief, when Richard Turnley, knowing nothing of the matter, happened to return from hunting, with a fine hog upon his back, as much as he could carry. He was immediately surrounded by the pirates, who seized upon the fresh meat, and which seemed to put them into better humor. They made Richard Cox carry it down to their boat, and when he had done, they gave him a bottle of rum to carry back to his companions to drink their healths, telling him that they might get home if they could, or if they stayed there, they never would trouble them any more. They were, indeed, as good as their words, for sailing away immediately, they made for Long Island Head, and coming up towards the salt ponds there, they saw at a distance in the harbor 3 vessels at an anchor, and supposing them to be either Bermudas or New York sloops lying there to take in salt, they bore down upon them with all the sail they could make, expecting a good booty. The turtle sloop taken from Benjamin Hutchins was by much the best sailor. However, it was almost dark before she came up with them, and then coming close alongside of one of them, she gave a broadside, with a design to board the next minute, but received such a volley of small shot in return, as killed and wounded a great many of the pirates, and the rest, in great surprise and fright, jumped overboard to save themselves by swimming ashore. The truth on't is, these sloops proved to be Spanish privateers, who, observing the pirates to bear down upon them, prepared themselves for action. The commander-in-chief of these 3 privateers was one who was called by the name of Turn Joe, because he had once privateered on the English side. He had also been a pirate, and now acted by virtue of a commission from a Spanish governor. He was by birth an Irishman, a bold enterprising fellow, and was afterwards killed in an engagement with one John Bonavie, captain of a privateer, belonging to Jamaica. But to return to our story, the sloop was taken, and on board her was found, desperately wounded, Phineas Bunce, who was the captain. By and by, a second of the pirate sloops came up. She heard the volley, and supposed it to be fired by Bunce. When he boarded one of the sloops, she came also alongside of one of the Spaniards, and received the welcome that was given to Bunce, and submitted as soon. A little after, came up the third, which was taken with the same ease, and in the same manner, as many of the pirates as could swim, jumping overboard to save themselves on shore, there not being a man lost on the side of the Spaniard. The next day, Turn Joe asked them many questions, and finding out that several amongst them had been forced men, with the consent of the other Spanish officers, ordered all the goods to be taken out of a Spanish launch, and putting some of the wounded pirates into the said launchy, with some provision, water, and other liquors, gave it to the forced men, to carry them to Providence. Accordingly, George Redding, Thomas Betty, Matthew Betty, Benjamin Hutchins, with some others, set sail and in 48 hours arrived in the harbor of Providence. They went on shore immediately, and acquainted the governor with everything that had passed from the time of their setting out, acquainting him that Phineas Bunce, who was one of the chief authors of all the mischief, was on board the launch. The governor, with some others, went and examined him, and he confessed all, wherefore there was no occasion for a trial, and as he had been pardoned before, and it was necessary to make some speedy example, it was resolved that he should be executed the next day, but it was prevented by his dying that night of his wounds. They also informed the governor of the condition of Turnley, Carey, and the rest, who were marooned by the pirates upon Green Key Island, upon which the governor sent for one John Sims, a mulatto man, who had a 2-mast boat in the harbor of Providence, very fit for sailing, and laying some provisions into the said boat, ordered him to get 5 or 6 hands, and to sail for Green Key, in order to bring off the 5 men there marooned. Sims accordingly made the best of his way, and sailing out in the morning, arrived at Green Key the next day towards evening. The poor people on shore saw them, and supposing them to be some of the pirates returned, thought it best to take to the wood and hide, not knowing what humor they might be in now. Sims and his shipmates carried some provision on shore, not knowing but they might want, and searched about, and calling out to them by their name. After wandering about some time, they came to the place where the fire was constantly kept, at perceiving which, they fancied they must be thereabouts, and that it would be best to wait for them there, and accordingly they sat them down, laying the provisions near them. Turnley, who was climbed to the top of a tree just by, saw them, and observed their motions, and fancied they were no enemies who were bringing them provisions, and, looking more earnestly, he knew Sims the mulatto, whom he was very well acquainted with, at Providence, upon which he called him, who desired him to come down, telling him the comfortable news, that he was come to the relief of him and his companions. Turnley made what haste he could to the bottom, and as soon as he was down, summoned his companions, who were climbed to the top of some neighboring trees, being in haste to communicate the glad tidings to them. Being all together, the mulatto related to them the history of what had happened to the pirates. That night they supped comfortably together upon the provision brought ashore, but so strange an effect has joy, that scarce one of them slept a wink that night, as they declared. The next day they agreed to go a-hunting, in order to get something fresh to carry off with them, and were so successful that they killed 3 fine hogs. When they returned, they made the best of their way on board, carrying with them all their utensils, and set sail for Providence, whither they arrived in 3 days. It being now just 7 weeks from the time of their being first set on shore by the pirates, the governor, in the meantime, was fitting out a sloop to send for Long Island, in order to take those pirates who had saved themselves near the salt ponds there, which sloop was now ready to sail, and put under the command of Benjamin Hornigold. Turnley and his companions embarked on board of her, and care was taken to get as many men as they could, who were entire strangers to the pirates. When they arrived at the said island, they run in pretty near the shore, keeping but few hands on deck, that it might look like a trading vessel, and those men that were quite unknown to the pirate. The pirates, seeing them, came only 2 or 3 of them near the shore, the rest lying in ambush, not without hopes of finding an opportunity to seize the sloop. The sloop sent her boat out towards the shore, with orders to lie off at a little distance, as if she was afraid. Those in ambush, seeing the boat so near, had not patience to stay any longer, but flocked to the water side, calling out to them to come on shore and help them, for they were poor shipwrecked men, almost perished for want. Upon which the boat rowed back again to the sloop. Upon second thoughts they sent her off again with 2 bottles of wine, a bottle of rum, and some biscuits, and sent another man, who was a stranger to those ashore, with orders to pass for master of the vessel. As soon as they approached them, the pirates called to them as before, begging them for God's sake to come on shore. They did so, and gave them the biscuit, wine, and rum, which he said he brought ashore on purpose to comfort them, because his men told him they were cast away. They were very inquisitive to know where he was bound. He told them to New York, and that he came in there to take in salt. They earnestly entreated him to take them on board, and carry them as passengers to New York. They being about 16 in number, he answered, he was afraid he had not provisions sufficient for so great a number, but that he would go on board and overhaul his provision, and, if they pleased, some of them might go with him, and see how his stock stood, that at least he would carry some of them, and leave some refreshment for the rest, till they could be succored another way, but that he hoped they would make him some recompense when they should arrive at New York. They seemed wonderfully pleased with his proposal, and promised to make him ample satisfaction for all the charges he should be at, pretending to have good friends and considerable effects in several parts of America. Accordingly, he took several of them with him in the boat, and as soon as they got on board, he invited them into the cabin, where, to their surprise, they saw Benjamin Hornigold, formerly a brother pirate. But what astonished them more was to see Richard Turnley, whom they had lately marooned upon Green Key. They were immediately surrounded by several with pistols in their hands, and clapped in irons. As soon as this was over, the boat went on shore again, and those in the boat told the pirates that the captain would venture to carry them with what provision he had, at which they appeared much rejoiced, and so the rest were brought on board, and without much trouble clapped in irons, as well as their companions. The sloop had nothing more to do, and therefore set sail, and reaching Providence, delivered the pirates all prisoners into the fort. A court of admiralty was immediately called, and they were all tried, and 10 received sentence of death. The other 6 were acquitted, it appearing that they were forced. The following 8 were executed in the manner described in the first volume: John Auger, William Cunningham, Dennis McCarty, William Lewis, Thomas Morris, George Bendel, William Dowling, and William Ling. George Rounceville was reprieved after he had been tied up and just going to be cast off, and was brought down to see the execution of the rest. But we cannot quit this story without taking notice of the fate of this George Rounceville. He worked for some time ashore for his living, but afterwards engaged himself with Captain Burgess, a pardoned pirate, who had received a commission to go a privateering. It happened they were driven upon the rocks to the southward of Green Key Island, and there they were beat to pieces. This Rounceville, with 5 others, on the first shot, stepped into the canoe, and were going off, when Burgess, standing upon the poop of his vessel, called out to him, saying, "Will you go away and leave me to perish in this manner?" Rounceville begged his companions to put back, and take him in, but they answered that the rest would be as willing to save themselves as he, and of consequence, so many would crowd into the canoe as would sink it, wherefore they would not venture it. Upon which he jumped into the water, and swam to the vessel, and there perished with his friend, since he could not save him. Chap. 18. The trial of the pirates at Providence. To Captain Johnson. I. Sir, as I am credibly informed you intend to oblige the public with a second volume of the lives and actions of the pirates, and are now actually collecting matter, I was of opinion that the sending you some minutes I have by me, which are authentic, would be no unacceptable office, and I hope the gentleman who was then governor of the Bahama Islands will not take the publication of the following trials in ill part, for I am informed he is in town. 1. Before I would send them to you, I examined very thoroughly whether he could have any ground to be offended, as I find them marks of his prudence and resolution, and that, in the condemnation and execution of the pirates, he had a just regard to the public good, and was not to be deterred from vigorously pursuing it, in circumstances which would have intimidated many brave men. I think the publication will do him both honor and justice, and therefore shall make no apology, but come to the point. Trial and condemnation of the pirates, who were executed at Providence, His Excellency Woodes Rogers, S.Q., being then Captain General, Governor, and Vice Admiral of the Bahama Islands, at a private consultation held on Friday the 28th of November, 1718, at the Secretary's office in the city of Nassau, New Providence, S.S. The Governor acquainting us that Captain Cochrane and Captain Hornigold have, by virtue of a commission, issued and directed to them for the apprehending of certain pirates, had the success to bring 10 of them prisoners to this part, who were now confined by an especial mittimus on board the ship Delicia. Therefore, desired we might agree to join in one opinion concerning the said prisoners, which, being maturely debated and considered, and that, as the necessary guard set on the prisoners for want of a guiole, very much fatigued both the soldiers and seamen, who equally guarded the fort and ship, and as many as could be spared, daily worked on the fortifications, and did the duty of sentinels at night, thereby harassing our small numbers of men, and hindering the public work, and there being suspected persons still remaining in these islands, whom may give frequent intelligence of our condition, should any fear be shown on our part, it might animate several now here, to invite the pirates without, to attempt the rescue of these in custody. Therefore, we do believe it most for the public good, when the fort is in a better state of defense, and Captain Beauchamp and Burgess, with about 60 soldiers and seamen, at this time gone to prevent the designs of Vane the pirate, are returned to strengthen us. The governor ought then, as soon as possible, notwithstanding he has made known to us that he has no direct commission for trial of pirates, yet according to the intent and meaning of the 6th article of the governor's instructions, which, in this case, refers to the 4th article in those given to the governor of Jamaica, a copy of whose instructions he has for his directions to govern himself by, as near as the circumstances of the place will admit, this corroborated with the power in the governor's commission of governor, captain, general, and vice admiral of the Bahama Islands, show the intention of his majesty for such authority here, and having an account that the proprietary government of Carolina had executed 22 pirates, lately carried in there, which together with the provoking ill example and behavior of these prisoners, who have all accepted his majesty's act of grace, and afterwards turned pirates again, and considering it would be a great risk and trouble to send so many to Great Britain, and much greater to keep them prisoners here, we are entirely of opinion His Majesty will approve of the necessity for the governor's judicial proceeding with these pirates, by a trial in the best manner we can according to law, and do verily believe the speediest execution for those who shall be found guilty will conduce most to the welfare of this government. N. B. R. Thus, this stands in the council book. The governor's secretary is answerable for want of connection, or the secretary of the islands. For I cannot find what these words can refer to. The governor ought then, as soon as possible. What ought he? But maybe it is an error in my friend, who himself brought over this copy, written in his own hand, which with the following I found among his papers after his decease. His Excellency Woodes Rogers, S.Q., Captain General, Governor, and Vice Admiral of the Bahama Island. To William Fairfax, S.Q., Captain Robert Beauchamp, Tho. Walker, S.Q., Captain Wingate Gale, Nathaniel Taylor, S.Q., Captain Josias Burgess, and Captain Peter Curran, Providence, S.S. By virtue of a commission from His Most Sacred Majesty King George, King of Great Britain, and C.all, to be Governor, and C.a. of these islands, thereby empowering me to authorize, commission it, and constitute all judges, justices, and magistrates in these islands, and C.o. as also by virtue of my commission, to be Vice Admiral of these islands, have power and authority to authorize and empower, constitute and commission it, proper judges and commissioners, for the trying, determining, adjudging, and condemning of all or any pirate or pirates taken, apprehended, and brought into this government, and in confidence of the loyalty, prudence, and integrity of you, the aforesaid William Fairfax, S.Q., Captain Robert Beauchamp, Thomas Walker, S.Q., Captain Wingate Gale, Nathaniel Taylor, S.Q., Captain Josias Burgess, and Captain Peter Curran, I do by virtue of these presents, authorize it, commission it, and appoint you deputy, judges, and commissioners of the said especial court, by these presents erected and appointed to be, and set in the city of Nassau, on Tuesday the 9th of this instant, to examine, hear, try, judge it, determine, and condemn all such pirate or pirates who are now in custody, and to be brought before the said court, to be tried for the offenses of piracy by them lately committed in and about these islands, and to proceed as my assistants, and as commissioners aforesaid, according to the laws of England, and rules of the said court in such cases, and for your so doing, this shall be your sufficient commission and authority, given under my hand and seal at Nassau, this 8th day of December, Anno Regni Quinto Georgi, Regis Magnae Britanniae, and C.A. Annoc, Domini, 1718, Woodes Rogers, New Providence, SSS, Chief of the Bahama Islands, at an especial Admiralty Sessions held in His Majesty's Guardroom in the city of Nassau on Tuesday the 9th and Wednesday the 10th of December, 1718. Before His Excellency Woodes Rogers, S.Q., Governor and Vice Admiral, and C. Will Fairfax, Esq., Judge of the Admiralty, Robert Beauchamp, Esquire, Thomas Walker, Esquire, Captain Wingate Gale, Nathaniel Taylor, Esquire, Captain Josias Burgess, Captain Peter Curran. Proclamation being made as usual, the register opened and read the governor's especial commission for erecting this court according to the intent and meaning of a late Act of Parliament, entitled, An Act for the more effectual suppression of piracy, by virtue of which said commission, the 7 afore named commissioners are appointed assistant judges for the hearing, trying, judging, and condemning the several persons now in custody, who stand committed for mutiny, felony, and piracy. Proclamation being again made that all persons concerned or summoned and required to appear at this court do give their due attendance. Ordered that the prisoners be brought to the bar, which being done, they were called by their respective names viz. John Augur, Will Cunningham, John Hips, Dennis McCarty, George Rouncivil, Will Dowling, Will Lewis, Thomas Morris, George Bendall, and Will Ling. Bind ye. Ordered that the aforenamed prisoners now at the bar do all hold up their hands. Ordered that the accusation against the prisoners be read, which was as follows. New Providence, est. The articles and accusations against John Augur, late master of the sloop Mary, of Providence, William Cunningham, gunner and mariner, on board the schooner, called the Bachelor's Adventure, Henry White, master, John Hips, boatswain and mariner, on board the sloop Lancaster, William Greenaway, master, Dennis McCarty, mariner, on board the schooner, William Dowling, mariner, on board the said schooner, William Lewis, marinere, on board the sloop Mary, though Morris, mariner, on board the said schooner, George Bendall, mariner, on board the said sloop Lancaster, and William Ling, mariner, on board the said schooner. You the said John Augur, Will Cunningham, John Hips, Dennis McCarty, George Rouncivil, William Dowling, William Lewis, Thomas Morris, George Bendall, and William Ling, having all of you lately received the benefit of His Majesty's most gracious pardon for your former offenses and acts of robbery and piracy, and having since taken the oaths of allegiance to His most sacred Majesty King George, and thereupon trust has been reposed in you, the said John Augur, and in the others of you, lawful employment's been bestowed to divert you all from your former and unlawful courses of life, and to enable and support you all in just and lawful ways of living, and you not having the fear of God before your eyes, nor any regard to your oaths of allegiance taken to your sovereign, nor to the performance of loyalty, truth, and justice, but, being instigated and deluded by the devil, to return to your former unlawful evil courses of robbery and piracy, and that you John Augur, Will Cunningham, John Hips, Dennis McCarty, George Rouncivil, Will Dowling, Will Lewis, though Morris, Geo. Bendall, and Will Ling, late master and mariners aforesaid, did on the 6th day of October last, about 7 in that evening, in the 5th year of the reign of our sovereign Lord George, by the grace of God, King of Great Britain and See of Great Britain, plot and combine together at a desolate island called Green Key, within the jurisdiction of this vice Admiralty, to mutiny and feloniously and piratically steal, take out, and carry away from the commanders and owners of the named vessels the said sloops and cargoes, tackle, apparel, and furniture, to the value of above 900 current money of these islands, and by force caused to be put ashore on the said desolate island, one Mr. James Kerr, merchant, and sundry others with him, and the said John Augur, as then commander of one of the said sloops, did proceed as commander of the said pirates from the said island of Green Key to Exhuman, where, by virtue of a commission directed to Captain John Cockram and Captain Benjamin Hornigold, you, the said John Augur, and the rest of your piratical company, were there taken and apprehended as pirates, and thereupon brought into this port, to be proceeded against, according to law. The prisoners holding up their hands, and the accusation being read, all the said prisoners were asked by the register whether guilty or not guilty, and they pleaded not guilty. ordered that the evidence for the king be severally sworn and examined. The examination of James Carr, gent. Doyle, upon oath saith that he being supercargo in trust, and outward bound James Carr, from Providence, a trading voyage in the sloop Mary, James Carr, and in about 2 days sail from the said island, did arrive at Green Key with 2 other vessels in company, bound also on the said trading account, where, on the 6th of October last, one Phineas Bunce, one of the said vessel's company, and the head mutineer of the pirates is now at the bar, but, since deceased, did then and there come on board the said sloop Mary, and very vilely treat this deponent, and in the evening did turn the deponent ashore upon the said Green Key, a desolate island. And this deponent farther saith, that Dennis McCarty, one of the prisoners now at the bar, was the only person of all the said pirates and mutineers who showed this deponent any civil treatment, and that the said McCarty did not reflect on the king and government as others of them now at the bar did. In this deponent's hearing, the examination of Captain William Greenaway upon oath saith that on the 6th of October last John Hips, one of the prisoners now at the bar, with some others of them, came on board the vessel under this deponent's command, and then riding at Green Key, with pretensions of getting tobacco, and told this deponent that Mr. Dwall Carr had a mind to sail that night, and this deponent having ordered his boat to go on board the schooner, then belonging to the said company, to give them notice of the said Carr's design, in which interim came on board John Auger and George Rounceville, both prisoners now at the bar, James Matthews and John Johnson, who wanted this deponent to go on board the schooner, which he did, where Phineas Bunce, since dead, met this deponent at the side, upon which this deponent demanded of the said Bunce the reason he did not prepare for sailing, as the rest did, whereupon Bunce, the head mutineer, asked this deponent to walk down into the cabin, and, when there, Bunce asked him to sit down by him, whereupon the said Bunce told this deponent he was his prisoner, upon which Dennis McCarty, now prisoner at the bar, presented a pistol at this deponent's breast, and told him, if he spoke a word, he, this deponent, was a dead man, and the said Phineas Bunce told this deponent he had best be easy, for that better part of the people belonging to the sloop Mary was on his side, as were some of the people he had with him. And then the said Phineas Bunce, with others, the mutineers, went on board the sloop Mary, and took her. But this deponent cannot particularize the names of the men who were with Bunce, being night time. Afterwards, the said Bunce, and the prisoners now at the bar, except John Hips, put Mr. James Kerr, Richard Turnley, Thomas Rich, John Taylor, and John Cox, all ashore at Green Key, a desolate island, and had the boat ready prepared to carry this deponent ashore also. But Bunce hereupon declared that this deponent, being a Bermudian, would swim aboard again, and therefore confide this deponent a prisoner, and plundered his vessel, leaving him not wherewithal to proceed anywhere, but a small quantity of flour and beef, obliging this deponent not to sail from Green Key in 24 hours after his departure. But this deponent did sail the next morning for Providence, and, in his way, fell in sight of the said mutineers and pirates, of whom the prisoners at the bar were some who gave chase, whereupon this deponent went back to Green Key, and took to the shore, where he saw the pirates, and said mutineers cut away the mast of this deponent's vessel, and then were coming on shore, as this deponent apprehended, to take his person. whereupon this deponent made his escape to hide himself from them upon the said quay. Then the people who were left on board this deponent's vessel, coming ashore, told this deponent that the pirates had scuttled her, turned the yawl adrift, and from Green Key the said pirates proceeded to Stocking Island, where meeting the Spaniards, the pirates were themselves taken and put ashore. W.M. Greenway. The examination of John Taylor upon oath saith that all the prisoners at the bar, except John Hips, did join with Bunce, the mutineer, and that Bunce and two more, whom the deponent knew not, being night, took the vessel he belonged to, and further saith that John Hips was at first confined with the said Greenaway by Bunce. John Taylor. The examination of Richard Turnley upon oath saith that on the 6th of October last, Bunce the head mutineer and two others, naming William Dowling and Thomas Morris, prisoners at the bar, did come on board the sloop Mary at Green Key, and asked Mr. Carr and this deponent for a bottle of beer, which was given them, and afterwards a second, and they commanded a third, and then, with the men belonging to the said sloop Mary, took up arms and took Mr. Carr, Thomas Cox, and this deponent prisoners, and forced them to go on shore at Green Key, a desolate island, about 25 leagues distant from Providence. Richard Turnley. The examination of John Cox upon oath saith that he being on board the sloop Mary, of which John Augur went out of Providence master, the said John Augur came on board his said sloop in the evening of the 6th day of October last, and lay down as if he designed to sleep. Soon after, Captain Greenaway, master of the sloop Lancaster, came on board, and asked the said Augur if he intended to set sail. He answered, he could not tell. Thereupon, Captain Greenaway went on board the schooner, called the Bachelor's Adventure, Henry White, master, and in about half an hour afterwards, came on board another boat with John Hips, Greenaway's boatswain, to inquire for Captain Greenaway, and in a little time after, Phineas Bunce came on board the sloop Mary from the schooner with 2 or 3 men more. Bunce asked for Captain Augur, and whether they had anything to drink, and coming to Mr. Carr, asked him for a bottle of beer, which Mr. Carr gave him. Then the said Bunce went into the cabin, and brought up a cutlash, and stood at the cabin door to drink, and swore that he was captain of that vessel, and would be so, which made Captain Augur ask him his meaning. But presently the said Bunce and Augur seemed to be good friends, and Bunce asked for another bottle of beer, then struck Mr. Carr with a cutlash on his back, and turned him and others ashore. And this deponent well knew all the several prisoners at the bar, except Hips the boatswain, and that all the rest were aiders, assistants, and abettors to the mutiny, felony, and piracy, committed upon the vessels and cargoes at Green Key. John Cox. The examination of Thomas Rich upon oath saith that he knows the several prisoners at the bar, and that they all, except Hips, were the actors of the mutiny and piracy, committed upon the vessels and cargoes at Green Key, and this deponent was taken by them in the Mary sloop, and put ashore with Mr. Carr and the other evidences for the king. Thomas Rich. The examination of Thomas Petty upon oath saith that he saw Hips beat by Bunce, and believes he was forced to go with him, and that Bunce would have forced this deponent also. But Dennis McCarty, prisoner at the bar, said if Bunce forced the deponent, he, the said prisoner, would leave Bunce in his company. Thomas Petty. And then the court adjourned till 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The court being met according to adjournment, and all the evidences for the king being called and examined, then the prisoners at the bar were severally called to know what defense each had to make, viz. John Augur, being first called to make defense for himself, saith no other than that he was in liquor, and knew not of Phineas Bunce his design, when the said Bunce entered on board the sloop Mary, whereof the prisoner was master, but could call no evidence to prove himself not guilty. John Augur Dortwy, William Cunningham, being next called and examined, said that he was asleep when Bunce went on board the schooner, to which the prisoner belonged, at Green Key, and that Bunce brought the said prisoner punch, and told him that he, the prisoner, must either join him, the said Bunce, or be put upon a maroon key, alias a desolate key. W.M. Cunningham. John Hips, prisoner, said in his defense that he did not in any wise enter with Bunce and his company, but went on board the aforesaid schooner to inquire for William Greenaway, his captain, where he was immediately confined by Bunce, together with Greenaway, and afterwards put on shore with Mr. Dodd, Carr, and others, where Bunce beat the said prisoner, and compelled him at length to join Bunce, but nevertheless declared his intention to leave the said Bunce and company on the first opportunity, and desired Mr. Carr, Captain Greenaway, Richard Turnley, Thomas Tyrrell, Benjamin Hutchins, John Taylor, John Jansen, Thomas Petty, and David Meredith might be examined for him. John Hips, Mr. Bowl, James Carr being sworn as evidence for the prisoner, declared that Bunce used much threatening language against John Hips, prisoner, that if he did not join him, the said Bunce and piratical company, and go with them into a boat, provided on purpose to carry the pirates to their rendezvous, Hips should repent the refusal, and farther says that he saw or knew of no blows given to compel the prisoner to assist or join the said pirates, but that the prisoner afterwards accepted the office and command of boatswain to the said piratical company. Captain Greenaway, being sworn for the prisoner, says that the prisoner went with him on board the schooner, and was in the cabin with him, and made prisoner with him on board the said schooner, where the prisoner made proposal to the deponent to surprise Dennis McCarty, prisoner, at the bar, then in a sentinel upon deck, and throw the said McCarty overboard. But the deponent, seeing no probability of escaping the rest, advised the prisoner to keep his mind to himself till he could have a better opportunity, and farther saith that the prisoner was put ashore with Mr. Carr and C. Richard Turnley, being sworn for the prisoner, deposed that to the best of his knowledge and remembrance, the prisoner was forced to accept of any duty the said Bunce and company put upon him, if the command of words be allowed by the court sufficient to excuse him. But he never saw Bunce, or any of the rest of the pirates, use blows to force him to join them. Thomas Tyrrell, inhabitant, being sworn, gave the prisoner the character of being an honest man, who was recommended to him by Thomas Bowling, master of the sloop Sarah, belonging to the said Thomas Tyrrell, that during a late voyage performed to Cuba, about 2 months ago, there was a mutiny suspected by Thomas Bowling, of which the said Bowling declared that John Hips, prisoner, was not only innocent, but believed a suppressor of the said mutiny, and farther declares that Thomas Bowling had acknowledged the safety of the vessel to be much owing to John Hips, prisoner, at the bar. Benjamin Hutchins, being sworn for the prisoner and examined, declared that the prisoner, after having been maltreated and seduced by Bunce and his accomplices, often complained to him, the deponent, that he would desert them the first opportunity, and showed his intentions by many tears shed, as tokens of sorrow for his late misfortune. John Taylor, being examined upon oath, declared that the prisoner was confined as a person not trusted by Bunce and his piratical company. John Jansen, being examined upon oath, had nothing to declare for or against the prisoner worth notice. Thomas Petty, being sworn for the prisoner, declared that Bunce threatened the prisoner, that if he would not consent to be of his piratical company, he should be frequently beat, and also be put on the first Maroon Key, where he might not find provision, water, or any other sustenance, which the deponent thinks compelled the prisoner to proceed with Bunce for his safety. David Meredith, being also examined upon oath, declared that when Phineas Bunce first made seizure of the vessel, he particularly spoke to Hips the prisoner, that if he would not take on in their way, he, the said Bunce, would maroon him upon some desolate key or island, and the more to compel him, gave him several blows with his cutlash, and thinks the prisoner was forced to join with Bunce. And c. Dennis McCarty, prisoner, being next called, and desiring that Mr. Carr, Captain Greenaway, John Taylor, Thomas Rich, and Thomas Petty might be admitted to give evidence for him. Dennis McCarty, Mr. Carr, being examined upon oath, declared that McCarty, prisoner, was as active as any other of the prisoners in their piratical designs, and has nothing more to speak in his favor than that the prisoner treated him and all others that were of the deponent's company with more civility than any others of the piratical crew did. Captain Greenaway, being sworn for the prisoner, declared that when Bunce beat the said deponent, the prisoner said that he would see who ought to be strikers amongst them for the future. John Taylor, being examined upon oath, declared that the prisoner should say that he would leave Bunce and his accomplices. Thomas Rich, being sworn, declared that he heard the prisoner say that since he had begun, he thought himself obliged to go on with them, meaning Bunce and his piratical company. Thomas Petty, being also sworn, declared that after McCarty had been an accomplice of Bunce's piracy, he heard the prisoner say he was sorry for his unadvisedness, which might bring great troubles on his poor wife, having a small child. George Rouncivil, prisoner, being next called, desired Turnley to be evidence for him, who, being sworn, declared that Geo. Rouncivil, after having consented to be of Bunce's piratical company, shewed some token of sorrow, but withal said that as he had begun, could not without danger of life desert the pirates he had combined. George Rouncivil, William Dowling, prisoner, being next called, and desiring Thomas Petty to be evidence for him, he was sworn, and said that he had very little to say for him, because he had seen the prisoner as consenting to their piratical designs as any of the said prisoners. William Dunkledale, Dowling, William Lewis, prisoner, being next called, had very little to say for himself, otherwise than that one David Meredith had heard him say he wished to be at John Cullamore's house to drink a bottle of beer, which David Meredith, being sworn as evidence for the prisoner, only confirmed. William Lewis. Thomas Morris, prisoner, being next called, had very little else to say than that he had the fever and ague when he was first commanded by Bunce to join them, and desiring Thomas Rich as evidence, he was sworn, and declared that the prisoner, as much as he took notice of him, appeared as active as the most capable, and could not say that the prisoner ever relented. Thomas Morris. George Bendel, prisoner, being next called, and desiring Richard Turnley for evidence, he was sworn, and declared that the prisoner was desired to make his escape, but was resolved to continue with the pirate. George Bendel. William Ling, prisoner, being next called, who, having nothing to say farther than a request that Richard Turnley might give in evidence for him, he was sworn, and declared that the prisoner bore arms, and was as resolved as any of the pirate. William Ling. Then the court adjourned till 10 o'clock next morning, being the 10th instant, December 10th, 1718. The court having met according to the adjournment, and proclamation made, the prisoners were again brought to the bar, and severally asked if they had considered of any farther evidence or defense they could propose. First, John Augur had no more to offer in his justification than before. The second, William Cunningham, the same as before. The third, John Hips, having the same question put, answered that if George Reading and Henry White had not been absent, they could have declared many things in his favor. Then the court proposed to every person who was an auditor of the trial that any might have leave to declare upon oath anything they had heard George Reading or Henry White say in behalf of John Hips, prisoner. Upon which Samuel Lawford, constable, appeared, and being sworn, declared that he heard George Reading say that he should have been glad to have done the old boatswain in any service, meaning Hips, the prisoner at the bar. For the said Reading had seen him cry for his having consented, though by force, to join Bunce, and c. the prisoner having also declared to Reading that he would fight each of the pirates singly, if he could by that means get clear of them. This deponent farther said that Reading told him he firmly believed the prisoner at the bar would have escaped from the other pirates as soon as he could have got an opportunity. The fourth, Dennis McCarty, prisoner, made some faint excuse, and at length desired Captain Benjamin Hornigold as farther evidence for him, who, being sworn, declared that when he, the said Hornigold, went to apprehend the prisoners, who were on one of the exhumakees, he, the said prisoner, was one of the first taken, and seemed to the said Hornigold to throw himself, and to have dependence, on the mercy of the governor. The fifth, George Rounciville, prisoner, had no farther plea to make. The sixth, William Dowling, prisoner, only desired Thomas Petty to be again called, who, being sworn, only declared that he, the prisoner, had offers made by the Spaniards to go in their service, but the prisoner refused them. The seventh, William Lewis, desired Richard Turnley might be called, who, being sworn, declared that he, the deponent, did not see the said prisoner when the sloop Mary was first taken, but the day after he saw the prisoner under arms, as active as any one of the pirates. The eighth, Thomas Morris, prisoner, had little more to say than pretending that several persons who were absent would say something in his justification, but no one present declared anything in his favor. The ninth, George Bendel, prisoner, had nothing to plead for himself, but desiring Mr. Carr for evidence, he was sworn, and declared that he heard the prisoner say that he wished he had begun the life sooner, for he thought it a pleasant one, meaning that of a pirate, and farther deposed that the prisoner reported that he had once a strong inclination to have smothered John Graves, S.Q., His Majesty's Collector for the Islands, as he lay feeble in his bed, whose servant the prisoner was, but a short time before he shipped himself for the intended voyage, when he joined the other prisoners at the bar in their mutiny and piracy. David Meredith, being also sworn, declared that Bunce did once beat the prisoner, who told him that if Bunce and C.E. beat him once more, he would desert them the first opportunity. The 10th, William Ling, had nothing farther to say for himself. Then the prisoners were remanded to the fort, after which all manner of persons were commanded by proclamation to withdraw. Then the court summed up the evidences for the king and the prisoners, which, being debated and considered, all the prisoners, except John Hips, were unanimously voted guilty of their indictment, and the register was ordered to draw up their sentence. It was thought convenient to respite the judgment on John Hips, prisoner, till Monday next, and the court adjourned till 4 this afternoon, at which time, being met according to adjournment, and proclamation made, the prisoners were brought to the bar. Then John Hips was remanded to the guardship in irons, and all the rest asked if they knew any cause why sentence of death should not be pronounced against them. They had nothing more to say, but to desire some length of time for repentance. Then the sentence was read, as follows. The court having duly considered of the evidence which hath been given, both for and against you the said John Auger, William Cunningham, Dennis McCarty, Geo Dole, Rouncivil W.M. Untie, Dowling W.M. Benoit, Lewis, Tho, Morris Geo Dotto, Bendel, and W.M. Ling, and having also debated the several circumstances of the cases, it is adjudged that you the said John Auger, W.M. Cunningham, Dennis McCarty, Geo Bordenstoy, Rouncivil, W.M. Todd, Dowling, W.M. Lewis, Tho, Morris, Geo.Il, Bendel, and W.M. Ling, are guilty of the mutiny, felony, and piracy, wherewith you and every one of you stand accused. And the court doth accordingly pass sentence, that you the said John Auger, W.M. Cunningham, Dennis McCarty, G.O. Poitry, G.O. Rouncivil, W.M. Dowling, W.M. Lewis, Tho, Morris, Geo. Bendel, and W.M. Ling, be carried to prison from whence you came, and from thence to the place of execution, where you are to be hanged by the neck, till you shall be dead, dead, and God have mercy on your souls. Given under our hands this 10th day of December, Anuk, Dom, 1718, signed, Woods Rogers, W.M. Fairfax, Robert Beauchamp, Thomas Walker, Wingate Gale, Nathaniel Taylor, Josias Burgess, Peter Coron. After sentence of death passed upon the prisoners, the governor, as president of the court, appointed their execution to be at 10 o'clock on Friday next in the morning, being the 12th instant. Whereupon the prisoners prayed for longer time to repent and prepare for death. But the governor told them that from the time of their being apprehended, which was on the 15th of November, they ought to have accounted themselves as condemned by the laws of all nations, which was only sealed now, and that the securing them hitherto, and the favor that the court had allowed them in making as long a defense as they could, wholly took up that time, which the affairs of the settlement required in working at the fortifications, besides the fatigue thereby occasioned to the whole garrison in the necessary guards, set over them by the want of a jail, and the garrison having been very much lessened by death and sickness since his arrival. Also that he was obliged to employ all his people to assist in mounting the great guns, and in finishing the present works, with all possible dispatch, because of the expected war with Spain, and there being many more pirates amongst these islands, and this place left destitute of all relief from any man of war or station ship, much wanted, joined to other reasons he had, too long to enumerate in court, he thought himself indispensably obliged, for the welfare of the settlement, to give them no longer time. Then the prisoners were ordered to the place of their imprisonment in the fort, where leave was given them to send for any persons to read and pray with them. On Friday morning each of the prisoners were called in privity, to know if they had any load upon their spirits, for actions committed as yet unknown to the world, the declaring of which was absolutely required, to prepare themselves for a fit repentance. But they each refused to declare anything, as well as making known to the governor if they knew of any conspiracy against the government. Wherefore, about 10 o'clock, the prisoners were released of their irons, and committed to the charge and care of Thomas Robinson, S.Q., commissioned provost marshal for the day, who, according to custom in such cases, pinioned them, and ordered the guards appointed to assist him, to lead them to the top of the rampart, fronting the sea, which was well guarded by the governor's soldiers and people, to the number of about 100. At the prisoners' request, several select prayers and psalms were read, in which all present joined. When the service was ended, orders was given to the marshal, and he conducted the prisoners down a ladder, provided on purpose, to the foot of the wall, where was a gallows erected, and a black flag hoisted thereon, and under it a stage, supported by 3 butts, on which they ascended by another ladder, where the hangman fastened the cords. They had 3/4 of an hour allowed under the gallows, which was spent by them in singing of psalms, and some exhortations to their old consorts, and the other spectators, who got as near to the foot of the gallows as the marshal's guard would suffer them, when the governor ordered the marshal to make ready, and all the prisoners expecting the launch. The governor thought fit to order George Rouncivil to be untied deep, and when brought off the stage, the butts having ropes about them were hauled away, upon which the stage fell, and the prisoners were suspended. A short account of the prisoners executed. First, John Augur, being about 40 years of age, had been a noted master of vessels at Jamaica, and since among the pirates, but on his accepting of His Majesty's Act of Grace and recommendations to the governor, he was, notwithstanding, entrusted with a good vessel and cargo, in which betraying his trust, and knowing himself guilty of the indictment, he all along appeared very penitent, and neither washed, shaved, or shifted his old clothes, when carried to be executed, and when he had a small glass of wine given him on the rampart, drank it with wishes for the good success of the Bahama Islands and the governor. The second, William Cunningham, aged 45, had been gunner with Teach the Pirate, who being also conscious of his own guilt, was seemingly penitent, and behaved himself as such. The third, Dennis McCarty, aged 28, who had also been formerly a pirate, but had accepted of the King's Act of Grace, and the governor had made him an ensign of the militia, being recommended as a sober civilized person, which commission he had at the time of his joining the pirates, which very much aggravated his other crimes. During his imprisonment, he behaved himself tolerably well, but when he thought he was to die, and the morning came, without his expected reprieve, he shifted his clothes, and wore long blue ribbons at his neck, wrists, knees, and cap, and when on the rampart, looked cheerfully round him, saying, he knew the time when there were many brave fellows on the island, who would not have suffered him to die like a dog, and at the same time pulled off his shoes, kicking them over the parapet of the fort, saying, he had promised not to die with his shoes on, so descended the fort wall, and ascended the stage, with as much agility and in a dress of a prize fighter. When mounted, he exhorted the people, who were at the foot of the walls, to have compassion on him, but, however willing, they saw too much power over their heads to attempt anything in his favor. The fourth, William Dowling, of about 24 years of age, had been a considerable time amongst the pirates, of a wicked life, which His Majesty's Act of Grace did not reform. His behavior was very loose on the stage, and after his death, some of his acquaintance declared he had confessed to them that he had murdered his mother before he left Ireland. The fifth, William Lewis, aged about 34 years, as he had been a hardy pirate and prize fighter, affected an unconcern at death, but heartily desired liquors to drink with his sufferers on the stage, and with the standers by. The sixth, Thomas Morris, aged about 22, had been a very incorrigible youth, and piratey, and seemed to have very little anxiety of mind by his frequent smiles when at the bar, being dresses with red ribbons as McCarty was with blue. He said, going over the ramparts, we have a new governor, but a harsh one, and a little before he was turned off, said aloud, that he might have been a greater plague to these islands, and now wished he had been so. The seventh, George Bendel, aged about 18, though he said he had never been a pirate before, yet he had all the villainous inclinations that the most profligate youth could be infected with. His behavior was sullen. The eighth, William Ling, aged about 30, not taken notice of before the last attempt, behaved himself as becoming a true penitent, and was not heard to say any other than by reply to Lewis, when he demanded wine to drink, that water was more suitable to them at that time. It was observed that there were but few, beside the governor's adherents, among the spectators who had not deserved the same fate, but pardoned by his Majesty's act of grace.